What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Reformed Reader, the channel where we review different forms of media through the lens of a Christian who is under the authority of the scriptures. My name is Josh, and today we're going to go over my top 10 favorite fantasy series of all time. Now, this is a tentative list because I'm filming this in February of 2025, so this is probably going to change over time because I am fairly new to reading in the grand scheme of things. I've only been reading for about 4 or 5 years now. So my list is malleable. It can definitely change, and it probably will. And I hope that it does. I hope some of these new series that I pick up will usurp some of these that are on this list, but there will probably be some that stay the same. So I'm going to start this list out with a couple of honorable mentions. The first being Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams. Now, I have these really nice broken binding editions right here. I have started Dragon Bone Chair on audio, and I've really enjoyed it, but I actually stopped because I want to physically read this because there are so many intricacies to this story that I do not want to miss anything. So I want to make sure that I read this physically rather than listening to it because I don't want to miss out on any of these details. And so that's honorable mention number one. Honorable mention number two is going to be the Licanius trilogy by James Islington. Now, the reason why this is on the honorable mention list and not actually on the active list is because I only read the first two books. Really, I got about halfway into book 2 and I stopped because I just wasn't in the mood to read that. And so I wasn't really hate reading it, but because I wasn't in the mood to read it, I was forcing myself to read it, and I didn't want to do that because I loved book 1. It was fantastic. And book 2 was definitely more of a setup book from what I read for the end. I know this is going to be in my favorites list, so I didn't want to force myself to read it. I wanted to wait and read it when I enjoyed it. So I'm going to come back to book 2 later on this year and hopefully finish that series this year. So let's start with my actual list. Number 10 on the list is going to be the Redwall series by Brian Jacques. Now, this is one of the series that got me into reading as a kid. This is the series that when we got sent to the library in school and we had to read books for AR points, if those of you know who know what that is, this was the series that kind of spoke to me. You know, people say all the time that you can't judge a book by its cover. I highly disagree with that sentiment for the most part. There's obviously outliers, but if you can't judge a book by its cover, then why are authors spending so much money on the covers of these books, trying to make sure that the illustrator encapsulates not just the themes, but the mood and the overarching story of the book in a picture? It's because a lot of the time you can judge a book by its cover. And this was one of those books because I went to the library. I had no interest in reading. I knew I loved the fantasy genre. I loved the sword fighting and magic and things like that as a young reader. And I just started scouring books and I pulled these books off the shelf. I believe it was actually Salamandastron or Lord Brocktree. I pulled that off the shelf and the cover just looked so cool. It was Lord of the Rings with animals. You know, I'm in. And that's essentially what this series is. It's an adventure tale with animals. So it's a fantastic series. There's also like I think there's 26 books, something like that. 20 something books in this series. And I've read the majority of them. So it has to be a series that I love in order to be that invested. So that's why it's number 10 on the list. Number 9 on the list is going to be the Star Wars Legends books. Now, this was the, I think, expanded universe previously, and now they've changed it to the Legends series. I want to make sure that I'm very specific about that because I detest the new Star Wars books. I detest the direction that Disney went with Star Wars. They have almost completely ruined Star Wars for me. But I loved the original trilogy. I loved the prequels. I grew up with those. I know, some people hate them. I think a lot more people appreciate them now, but I loved those stories. And so when we got the extended universe, or Legends is what it's now referred to as, when we got some of these books and I got some of these in my hand, this is what I was looking for. This is the Star Wars that I remember. And so a lot of people would say, well, this is sci-fi. Well, it's fantasy because there are fantastical elements here. There is some magic at play with the Force. And so I loved Darth Plagueis. I'm about to pick up Darth Maul Shadowhunter. I've read some of the 501st Legion. Those books are so great. So I highly recommend these books. And a lot of times you can kind of just pick them up whenever. They're great palate cleansers. I mean, there are some mini series within the series as a whole, but you can kind of just go and pick one up that sounds interesting to you and give it a read. And if you love the old Star Wars, I guarantee you'll love quite a few of these books. So number 8 on the list is going to be The Empire of the Wolf trilogy by Richard Swan. This trilogy was excellent. From the first page to the last page in the trilogy, you are thrown into this gritty, bleak fantasy world where it's a very soft magic system, meaning that it's not real intricate. They don't dive into how the science of the magic works or anything. It's similar to Lord of the Rings, where they just kind of mention how are people able to do these things? And their answer is magic. I'm perfectly fine with that. I like that. There's mystery left. It leaves that sense of whimsy and wonder to the reader. And not only that, because it's open-ended and there's not a ton of rules with the magic system, it opens itself up to being able to flesh this story out in a greater way. So the Empire of the Wolf trilogy to me was an excellent read for the time that I read it, because I was looking for something that was a little more leaning towards the horror genre, but to have a bit of people call this cosmic horror or fantasy horror. It does have some of that elements, but I would say it's less of horror and it's more of their books filled with dread. They are fantasy books in a gritty, bleak world that has that looming dread as an undercurrent of the entire series. So this series to me was fantastic from the first book to the last. Now the story definitely, I would say, evolves from the first book to the last. And to me, I thought this series was just phenomenal. To me, it's just an amazing series set in a more bleak world. So this is a great adult fantasy series. So I highly recommend it. Number 7 on this list is going to be The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. Now, I was a little hesitant to put this on the list because it's unfinished, but from what I've read so far, this series is one of my absolute favorites, and it very well may jump higher up on the list in the future with how Ryan is able to wrap this series up. It is excellent. I mean, it has to be good for me to read Of War and Ruin, which is I think it was 1,470 something pages in physical, like in hardback. And the reason why he trimmed it down, which he did trim it down to that, is because the publisher could not fit more pages into one volume.
Wow.
And so it has to be a compelling story for me to pick this up. So this is Dragon Rider fantasy for adults. It is just phenomenal. The characters are great. The world is enormous. Without even looking at the maps, it feels like this world is just immense. This is that Dragon Rider fantasy with a bit of a twist. So if you like the Dragon Rider fantasy, I would say if you liked Star Wars and Aragon and Lord of the Rings, or Wheel of Time, this is a series for you. Make sure you pick it up, because I am probably going to pick up the next book day one and just binge that book, because this story is so great and it really pulls you in, which is what I want for a fantasy book. Number 6 on the list is going to be The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, this was another one that I was a little hesitant to put on the list for a couple of reasons. Number 1, because it's unfinished. And number 2, because I am not a fan of the author. Now, I don't hold this same animosity that other people have for the author. I do think that he made promises that were unfulfilled and really stained his reputation with his fans and with the community. And that, to me, that seems to be part of the reason why I don't think we'll ever see The Doors of Stone, or we'll ever see this series completed. It's because he's written himself not only into a corner, but he also has alienated his fan base. And so now fans of the book, which a lot of people either love or hate this series. So this is already a polarizing series. But then on top of that, he has now polarized his fan base for those who are able to separate the artist from the art. So this is pretty high on my list, though, because The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. I read those two books back to back, and that story has been one that has stuck with me more than almost any other story. It constantly is there's nuance to the story that is playing over in my mind over and over and over. I love watching videos where people are able to break some of these things down and show things that we missed, and it makes the gears just still turn on what is the series, where is it going. This is the series that I have to have more. I'm longing for that third book, even though it may never come. But even if it doesn't, this story changed the way that I look at fantasy. So that's why it is so high up on my list. Now we get to number 5. Number 5 is going to be the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. These are the only books that I've read by Robin Hobb so far, and it is fantastic. This first trilogy is fantastic, and it is compartmentalized in such a way that you can finish up book 3 and be satisfied and not come back to the rest of them, in my opinion. Now, I say that as someone who hasn't read further on, which I plan to, I fully intend to, but I think that someone could read these first 3 books and be satisfied with that story and still love the characters and the story and the world that we were thrown into. Also, Robin Hobb, to me, is one of the best authors I've ever read. She's able to articulate things and convey things to the reader in such a way that I think is few and far between, not just in the fantasy genre, but out of any authors that I've read in any genre. Her perspective on things is not just unique, but it's so expressive that it has caused me to think about things from a different point of view in the real world. But this trilogy is excellent, and it is one that is a bit dour. It is sometimes painful to read, but you have to keep turning the page to see what happens to Fitz. So that's why it is so high up on the list. I love this series. Please pick it up if you haven't already. Number 4 on the list is going to be The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. Now, again, this series has to be fantastic for me to read 17 books of it. I know that the Dresden Files can be a bit of a mixed bag for some. I know a lot of people, when I first picked it up, said the first 3 or 4 books are just not good. But if you get through the first 3 or 4 books, then it gets better. And I agree with some of that, but I had a good time with book 1. Again, it very well could be because I'm not as well seasoned as a fantasy reader, but I picked up book 1 and read it physically, and I had a good time with it. This is someone who grew up with shows like Kolchak and The X-Files, and I loved those shows. And this was very reminiscent of that. They were episodic in nature, and it almost was Monster of the Week. And Mike over at Mike's Book Reviews talks about how similar it is to the Buffy the Vampire Slayer show, which I never watched. But he loved that series so much and how episodic it was, and yet had this underlying story that strung all the other books together. But Mike kept saying that people over on his channel kept telling him how good the audiobooks were. So I picked those up, and they were just phenomenal, to the point to where now when I read these books physically, I hear the narrator, James Marsters, reading the book to me in that voice. I mean, that is Harry Dresden's voice to me. And so these books to me are just phenomenal. I would actually say that I preferred some of the early books to some of the middle books. I know the one book that everybody claims to be, I mean, it is just overwhelmingly positive. As they say, the book changes just, it was my favorite, or it did so much. But to me, that was where it kind of lulled a little bit. I didn't like that as much. There were some things in there that I wasn't as fond of. But overall, this series has been fantastic, and I can't wait to keep reading when the next book comes out, hopefully this year. So that leads me to number 3 on the list is going to be The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Now, some of you may be wondering, as a Christian, how can I put Narnia so low on the list at number 3? Because while I love the intent, I love the theme of the story, it just wasn't written for me at this time. Because I came to this series as an adult. And so there are several things about the series that are written for younger readers. Even the style that the book is written in, it's just not written for me. Now, this sounds like I'm being negative on these books. I'm not. I'm having to find reasons why it is not number 1. And so there's little things, but when I read The Magician's Nephew, the entire scene of creation, I almost highlighted every line. It was so good. And to me, I don't know that he's going to be able to top that. I have yet to finish it. I think I have 2 books left in the series before I complete it. But The Magician's Nephew, reading that as an adult just blew me away at how C.S. Lewis was able to articulate the creation story from a different perspective. It's just phenomenal. So if you're an adult that is looking for a fantasy book that is not long, that will not just uplift and edify you, but will light a fire in your spirit, read Magician's Nephew. It is so fantastic. So The Chronicles of Narnia is a phenomenal series by a great man. So that's why it is number 3 on the list. Number 2 on the list is going to be Solo Leveling by Gong. I read the series last year and basically binged the entire thing. This is, I believe, a 7 or 8 book series. I think it's 8, but the 8th book, I think only the first 20% is the actual story, and the rest of it is sort of like an epilogue of the last book. And I almost stopped and didn't read the epilogue, and I had a friend of mine tell me that I had to finish it. So I did, and I'm so glad that he recommended that because it wraps everything up so well. This is a story that from start to finish is perfect. It is perfect from the first line to the last. This is for an adult. Make no mistake, because there is quite a bit of brutality in this book. And I wouldn't really consider myself a fan of progression fantasy, but he was able to do this in such a unique way that while the character was leveling up, it didn't seem like that I was watching a video game, which is how a lot of people describe that progression fantasy is. Okay, I got to go complete this quest and level my character up so that I can beat the boss. And while those things kind of were occurring, it wasn't occurring in that way. This series is so phenomenal. It is so good that I have this right here, this special edition that has combined every book into one volume. I love this series so much, and I plan to revisit it soon. It was just so great. The writer was able to elevate the stakes with each book, which I didn't think possible after even book 1 or 2. And he continued to raise the stakes and still subvert the reader's expectations. Again, phenomenal series. Can't recommend it enough. Please pick it up. And that's why it's number 2 on my list. So this brings me to the number 1 fantasy series of all time. And to me, it's a tie.
What?
Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, that's a cop-out, but these are my honest opinions about it. I have a tie for first, and it's going to be The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. Now, I know some people may be flipping tables at this point. How in the world could you even compare the two? Because I love them both for different reasons. So I want to talk about The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, obviously, it's probably going to be most people's favorite fantasy series of all time. It may even be the only fantasy book that some people read. It is just the best story I've ever read. It's such a story of hope and courage and good versus evil and love and friendship, how we navigate those things in the face of adversity. It is just a phenomenal story. And for anybody out there, I've already said this once, but I'm going to say it again. Samwise Gamgee is the hero of the story. Samwise Gamgee is my favorite character of all time of any book, bar none. I love, love, love this book. And I love that Sam, while being sort of a side character, truly was the hero. And without him, none of that would have occurred. But Samwise Gamgee, to me, favorite character of all time. But I'm not going to be one of those people that says that this story is flawless, because there are things about it that I did not prefer. I'm not crazy about Tom Bombadil. I know that's not an unpopular opinion, but I also wasn't crazy about how the Two Towers was structured into the two halves, where you follow half of the Fellowship and you don't even hear about Sam and Frodo until you get to part 2, and then all you hear about is Sam and Frodo. So I'm not as crazy about that, but obviously Tolkien is a master, and I'm just, some guy from Podunk, Alabama that is criticizing his work. But I do still love that story. And so there are things about the movies that I prefer to the books, and there's things about the books that I prefer to the movies. So I almost look at it as one cohesive story. And so for me, it just holds such a special place in my heart, which is why it has to be tied with Harry Potter. because Harry Potter to me was the story that got me into reading. It was the story that kept me reading, and it was the first story that made me cry. I grew up with these books, and I don't just mean that I grew up reading these books. I mean, as you read the series, and for those of you that have, they get progressively more mature, and they hit me at each stage that our characters were experiencing in the books. And so I read the first book at around 11 years old, and then I jumped into book two, and then I had a bit of a break in between. And each year I read these books, and I actually didn't finish the series until I was an adult. And I came back and reread all these books, and there is just such not just nostalgia, and it's not that I'm just putting on the glasses of nostalgia and saying this is why I love these books. It's because of nostalgia. No, these books really are part of my childhood. Now, from somebody that didn't grow up with an amazing childhood, it was easy for me to escape into these books and to see the hope and courage and love and friendship that these characters had in these books that I didn't get to experience as much as a young, nerdy kid that was sort of an outlier in school. These books really, really did wonders for me, and they helped me keep my head up in tumultuous times at home. So there's no way that I could not have this series near the top of my list, because even when things were going on around me that I had no control over, I could escape. I could go to my room and open these massive books and escape into this fantasy world where, while our characters faced similar things, that they were able to overcome them, and not even by extraordinary means, but through the expression of love for one another, of that friendship, of hope. And for those of us who are Christians, if you read this series, instead of trying to just criticize it for it having magic in it, which is your prerogative to do, if you instead approach it with the mindset of look for Christian themes here, because even the author stated that the story of Harry Potter is heavily themed in the Christian faith. And I would argue that very strongly that is woven through each book all the way to the end. So these books to me hold such a special place in my life that when I think of my childhood, these books come to mind very quickly. These books helped me in so many ways, and they taught me so much that they have to be up at the top of the list with The Lord of the Rings. Now, the reason why they are tied is because I genuinely could not choose one over the other. I love them both equally, but differently. And I would even argue that I look at it like my two children, right? I have a son and a daughter. I love them each equally, but my expression of that love is different for so many reasons. So with these two series, it's very similar in the sense that I love them both equally, just differently. So guys, that's my top 10 favorite fantasy series of all time. What are some of your favorite series? Let me know if I missed one, or if there's one that I should pick up down in the comment section below. Guys, thank you so much again for watching these videos. Please, if you like this video, hit that thumbs up button. It does help me. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, but most of all, please share these videos with your Christian brothers and sisters, because I want to be a good resource to my brothers and sisters, for those who maybe want to spend their time, money, and energy on things that don't dishonor the Lord. So please share these videos to your Christian brothers and sisters. Thank you guys again so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.